Somewhere around the 8th mile of the drive north from Metairie, Louisiana, the land behind you disappears. Not gradually, the way a coastline fades on a long ferry ride, but completely, all at once, until there is nothing visible in any direction except gray water and a narrow ribbon of concrete stretching ahead. For roughly 8 of the bridge's 24 miles, there is no shore to look at, no exit to take, and on a foggy morning, sometimes barely enough visibility to see the car in front of you. An electronic sign near the entrance sometimes flashes a single warning before drivers commit to the crossing: reduced visibility ahead. If you are new here, subscribe before you keep going, because this channel exists to walk through roads exactly like this one. The ones most people will never drive, but that quietly decide who comes home and who does not. The bridge in question is the Lake Pontchartrain Causeway, 23.5 miles of twin concrete spans connecting Metairie, on the outskirts of New Orleans, to Mandeville on the lake's north shore. It holds the Guinness World Record for the longest continuous bridge over water on the planet, a title it has carried, with one brief and contested interruption for most of its existence. This video is not about a villain. No single agency buried a warning or ignored a report here. What makes this bridge dangerous is simpler and harder to legislate away. Fog forms over open water quickly and without much warning, and for nearly half an hour at a time, drivers crossing the causeway have nowhere to go but forward. Lake Pontchartrain itself is part of what makes the crossing unpredictable. It is a shallow, brackish estuary, averaging only 10 to 16 feet deep across most of its 610 square miles, fed by freshwater rivers and streams, but connected to the Gulf of Mexico through narrow tidal passes. That mix of fresh and salt water, combined with the lake's shallow depth, means the water temperature and the air temperature above it can diverge quickly, especially in the cooler months. And when warm, moist air meets a cooling surface, dense fog can form over the open water far faster than it does on land. Because the bridge sits only about 16 feet above the water at its lowest points, drivers are crossing almost at the surface of the lake itself, with none of the elevation that might otherwise let them see over a low-lying fog bank. Add crosswinds, which are common and largely unbroken by any terrain for miles in every direction, and the same open geography that makes the causeway a marvel of engineering also makes it uniquely exposed to Louisiana's weather. The idea for a bridge across the lake dates back to the early 1800s, to a ferry service run by Bernard de Marigny, the founder of Mandeville. But it took more than a century for the project to become real. Businessman Ernest Loeb began pushing for a modern crossing in 1948, and his lobbying led the Louisiana legislature to create what is now the Greater New Orleans Expressway Commission, still known locally, simply known as the Causeway Commission, to oversee construction and, later, operation of the bridge. The Louisiana Bridge Company built the original span in just 14 months, using assembly line techniques that were considered revolutionary for bridge construction at the time. Precast concrete sections manufactured on shore and then set into place across the lake on more than 9,000 pilings driven into the soft lakebed. The first span opened to traffic on August 30th, 1956, at a cost of about $46 million. As traffic grew far beyond what its original designers had anticipated, a second parallel span opened in May of 1969, turning what had been a single two-way road into 2 one-way bridges running side by side, 80 feet apart. For decades, those 2 narrow spans, 28 feet wide each, carried traffic with almost no shoulder to pull onto in an emergency, and only 7 designated crossover points, along the entire 24-mile length where a driver could turn around or switch spans. That geometry is the second layer of danger, separate from the fog itself. A minor fender bender or a stalled vehicle in one of the two lanes on a span could not simply be nudged onto a shoulder the way it would on almost any other highway in the country. It sat in the lane, forcing every vehicle behind it to stop or swerve, often with limited visibility and virtually no advance warning, on a bridge where the posted speed limit in clear conditions reaches 65 miles an hour. The lake has interrupted the bridge with force more than once. In the early morning hour of January 17, 1960, dense fog was sitting over the lake when an empty barge, adrift and largely invisible in the murk, rammed directly into the causeway, tearing out two 52-foot sections of roadway and damaging a third. A tractor trailer loaded with groceries happened to be crossing one of those sections at the moment of impact and narrowly made it to solid roadway before the concrete gave way behind it. No one died in that incident, but the bridge, then still a single span, was closed for several days while crews rebuilt the gap. 4 years later, on June 16, 1964, the same combination of fog and barge traffic proved fatal. Barges again struck the bridge, tearing open a section of roadway, and a bus crossing at the time plunged into the lake through the gap. 6 passengers died. The incident was significant enough to make the front page of the New York Times the following day, one of the starkest reminders in the bridge's history that the danger here was never only about individual driver error, but about the fundamental vulnerability of a 2-lane roadway sitting just 16 feet above open, fog-prone water with barge traffic passing beneath it. More recent incidents have looked different, but the underlying mechanism has not changed. On the morning of December 17, 2024, a dense fog advisory was in effect over Lake Pontchartrain when visibility over parts of the lake, including the bridge, dropped below 1 mile. Within about 30 minutes, 6 separate crashes broke out across both spans, the first near the 18-mile marker on the southbound bridge, a second almost simultaneously on the northbound side, and additional collisions scattered along both roadways. Causeway General Manager Carlton Dufresnoy later estimated that somewhere between 40 and 70 vehicles were ultimately involved, though he was careful to say he could not give an exact number with confidence. 33 people were taken to hospitals, according to officials with St. Tammany Parish's fire district, though none of the injuries were considered life-threatening. Witnesses described the scene in vivid terms. Gary Cassard, a driver caught near the crash site, said the fog had become so thick he could barely see a block ahead of his vehicle, and that he heard what sounded like explosions behind him as cars, including an 18-wheeler, collided in the murk. Irene Goddard, the driver of that 18-wheeler, said she had been driving along thinking conditions were manageable when she suddenly saw brake lights ahead and had to brake hard herself, watching as the truck ahead of her was unable to stop in time and plowed into several other vehicles. Roughly 30 stranded motorists eventually had to be evacuated by transit vans. Because their own vehicles were too damaged to drive off the bridge, the causeway remained closed in both directions for nearly 8 hours, while crews cleared wreckage across 2 lanes stretched over 24 miles of water. A recovery effort officials described as logistically enormous given how little space there was to work with. Remarkably, no one died. It is worth pausing here to address something directly, in the same spirit of honesty that this format applies to any disputed statistic. A number of unofficial websites and social media posts circulate dramatic, often very large claimed death tolls for the Lake Pontchartrain Causeway, numbers that get repeated from one travel blog to another without a traceable original source. Reviewing the verifiable public record, including contemporary news coverage of specific incidents like the 1964 bus crash and the 2024 pileup, does not support those larger, more sensational figures. The documented fatal incidents on this bridge are real, serious, and worth understanding. But they are also more limited and more specific than some of what circulates online, concentrated heavily around a small number of fog and barge-related events, rather than distributed evenly across decades of ordinary traffic. Repeating an unverified number because it sounds more dramatic would be exactly the kind of shortcut this format exists to avoid. What the Causeway Commission has done with that documented history is arguably the most distinctive part of this particular road's story. Rather than deny or minimize the danger of driving 24 miles over open water with virtually no shoulder, the Commission spent much of the last decade addressing it directly. Beginning in 2019, the Commission undertook a roughly $100 million safety upgrade, adding 12 new safety shoulders across the two spans, 6 per bridge, each one stretching as long as 1,008 feet, giving stranded or disabled vehicles a place to pull completely out of the traffic lane for the first time in the bridge's history. According to the Commission's own figures, that single change reduced collisions on the causeway by roughly 25%. To help fund the project, southbound tolls were raised in 2017. The Commission also operates a police escort convoy service specifically for drivers who find the crossing intimidating in fog, low light, or high anxiety, allowing nervous motorists to follow a patrol vehicle across at a controlled pace rather than attempt the drive alone. Electronic message boards posted at both approaches now warn drivers in real time when fog, high winds, or storms are affecting conditions ahead. And during the worst weather, certain vehicle types, including motorcycles, recreational vehicles, and even glass-hauling trucks, are barred from crossing entirely until conditions improve. None of this has eliminated the underlying hazard, because the underlying hazard is not a policy choice sitting on someone's desk, waiting to be corrected. It is the lake itself, shallow, warm, relative to the air above it in the cooler months, and large enough that weather can change from one end of the crossing to the other before a driver reaches the far shore. Fog is going to keep forming over Lake Pontchartrain the way it always has, sometimes rolling in over the space of only a few minutes, transforming a clear 25-minute commute into a slow, blind crawl behind taillights that may or may not still be moving. The difference the safety shoulders, the convoy service, and the warning signs have made is not that the fog stopped forming. It is that when it does, a stalled or damaged vehicle finally has somewhere to go besides directly in front of the next car. That, in the end, is the real lesson of this bridge, and it is a more modest one than a story about villains or negligence would offer. The Lake Pontchartrain Causeway was never hiding what it is. 24 miles of narrow roadway sitting 16 feet above a lake that produces fog on its own schedule, not the driver's. Every documented fatal incident here, from the barge strike in 1960 to the bus that went into the water in 1964, to the 6 crash pileup that, remarkably, killed no one in 2024, traces back to the same basic fact. Once you commit to the crossing, past the point where the shoreline disappears behind you, the only way through is forward, at whatever speed the fog and the drivers around you will allow. Heed the message board. Slow down before you can see why you need to. On a bridge with no land in sight for 8 miles, that warning is not a suggestion. It is the entire safety plan.